Every year, thousands of people report being taken. Not seduced, not invited, taken. Against their will, from their beds, from their cars, from the middle of fields at 3 a.m. And the beings doing the taking are described by witnesses separated by decades, by oceans, by language, in nearly identical terms. Large heads, enormous black eyes, grey skin, 4 feet tall, no mouths that move, the grey. What strikes me isn't that people report being abducted. It's what they all say happens in the first 60 seconds. That's where this investigation begins. 60 seconds, 1 minute. The average duration, according to a striking convergence of abduction testimonies across 7 decades of documented reports, of what researchers have come to call the initial contact phase. That first brutal window of time between the moment a witness becomes aware of the being's presence and the moment they are, for lack of a better clinical word, processed. I've spent months going through the transcripts, MUFON case files, the Hopkins files, the Bullard survey, the Sprinkle sessions, and what I found wasn't chaos. What I found was a script, the same script, repeated, across thousands of miles and thousands of days by people who, in most cases, had never met, never compared notes, never read a book about alien abduction before it happened to them. That consistency, that almost bureaucratic uniformity, is where this story begins to crack open. Let me give you the scene as it's described most commonly. It is between midnight and 4 a.m. The witness is alone, or nearly alone. They are in a state of light sleep, or in a vehicle, or standing in an open space. And then something changes, not with a bang, with a stillness, a quality of silence that multiple witnesses across multiple continents have struggled to articulate, but which they consistently reach for the same words to describe. Betty Andreasson-Luca, whose 1967 abduction account in South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, became one of the most thoroughly documented cases in UFO research history, described it this way to researcher Raymond Fowler in 1977. Everything went quiet. The TV stopped. The kids stopped. The whole house went like it was frozen. And I knew before I even saw them, that something was there. Not heard, not seen. Known. That's the first anomaly. Kirsan Ilyumzhinov, former president of Kalmykia, a republic within Russia, claimed in 2009 that he was visited in his Moscow apartment in September 1997. He described the onset of his experience in terms that echo Andreasson-Luca's account, almost verbatim. An unnatural silence, a cessation of normal environmental sound, a precognitive awareness of presence before any physical entity was observed. Bridget Nielsen, interviewed in Sedona, Arizona in 2014, said something similar. The first thing wasn't seeing them. The first thing was the quiet, like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. Antonio Vilas-Boas, the Brazilian farmer who reported being abducted in October 1957 from a field in San Francisco de Sales, described the tractor engine cutting out, not dying gradually, but stopping instantly mid-operation before any beings appeared. A tractor engine, a television set, the ambient noise of a house full of children, all stopping, all at once, all before any visual contact. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Is this a psychological artifact, the mind imposing retrospective silence on the memory of a frightening experience? Possibly. But then why does the silence come first? Why consistently does it precede the sighting rather than accompany it? Why do witnesses not say, "I saw them," and then everything went quiet, but almost universally report the sequence in reverse? This simple question of sequencing, silence first, then presence, is, once you notice it, extraordinarily difficult to explain away. Let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the 60-second window becomes genuinely strange. After the silence, typically described as lasting between 5 and 15 seconds, the witnesses report what researchers have informally termed the freeze. Not sleep, not unconsciousness, a paralysis that preserves full sensory awareness while eliminating the possibility of voluntary physical movement. Whitley Strieber, whose 1987 memoir Communion brought abduction accounts into mainstream cultural consciousness, described the sensation in terms of breathtaking specificity. The paralysis, he wrote, was not like being held down. It was as if the intention to move had been removed from him, not the physical capacity, but the neurological signal. He could feel his limbs, he could feel the sheets beneath him, he simply could not, in any meaningful sense, decide to move them. This is an important distinction, and it keeps showing up. Karin Hopper, whose account was collected by Dr. Johannes Viehbag in Germany in 1994, described lying in her bed in Frankfurt, watching three beings move through her bedroom wall and feeling not terror, though terror came later, but a strange, dislocated calm. "I wanted to scream," she told Viehbag, "but it was like wanting to fly. The wanting was there, the ability was simply gone. The wanting was there, the ability was simply gone." That phrase has stayed with me, because it doesn't describe what sedatives do, it doesn't describe what fear does, it describes something more surgical than either. Dr. David Jacobs, a historian at Temple University who spent decades researching and conducting hypnotic regression sessions with abductees, observed in his 1992 work Secret Life that the paralysis described across his hundreds of case subjects was neurologically consistent, meaning the experience as described by witnesses mapped onto what we would expect if a specific neural pathway, rather than general motor function, were being targeted or suppressed. I am not a neuroscientist. I cannot validate that observation clinically, but I can observe that the description is consistent everywhere. Across cultures that have entirely different frameworks for understanding what paralysis means, the experience described is the same. Not muscular, not chemical, something upstream of the muscle, something at the level of intention. And then they float. This is the next phase, almost invariably. After the freeze, witnesses report being lifted, not grabbed in most cases, not physically seized, lifted horizontally, bodily from wherever they are lying or standing. And the manner of this lifting is described in terms that suggest levitation rather than mechanical transport. Katarina Wilson, who documented her own experiences extensively in The Alien Jigsaw, 1993, described being elevated from her bed in Portland, Oregon, in the early 1980s as feeling like I'd become weightless. Not that anything was carrying me, more like gravity had changed its mind about me. Changed its mind about me. Jim Weiner, one of the four witnesses in the 1976 Allagash abductions in Maine, a case notable for involving multiple adult witnesses who were later hypnotically regressed independently and produced corroborating accounts, described the same quality of weightless transport. I wasn't grabbed, I was just moved. Like a piece of furniture you slide across a floor but without friction, without effort, like I didn't have weight anymore. What strikes me, going through these accounts, is that no one ever describes being carried. Nobody says, I felt arms under me. Nobody says, I could feel their grip. The transition from contact to transport is seamless, as if the mechanism of movement bypasses physical handling entirely. Is this possible? With our current understanding of physics, no. With technologies we cannot yet characterize. That question remains for now uncomfortably open. I want to spend some time on the eyes, because this is where the 60-second window takes what I consider its most psychologically significant turn. The physical description of the grey, short, grey-skinned, large-headed with enormous wraparound black eyes has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that it's become almost a cliché. But that cultural saturation is itself worth interrogating, because the description in its specific detail predates the pop cultural image. Betty and Barney Hill's 1961 account documented initially through contemporaneous notes with psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, described eyes that Barney Hill found uniquely terrifying. Not because they looked aggressive, but because they seemed to communicate something directly, bypassing the usual channels of expression. I felt as though his eyes were pushing into my eyes, Barney Hill said during a regression session in 1964. Not looking at me, pushing, like they were going inside, not looking, pushing. Now crossed 6,000 miles to Zimbabwe. In September 1994, 62 children at the Ariel School in Ruwa, outside Harare, reported seeing small beings near a craft that had landed on the school grounds. The children, aged 6 to 12, from multiple cultural backgrounds, who had had no prior exposure to Western UFO iconography, drew remarkably consistent pictures of the beings. The eyes featured prominently, large, black, overwhelming in proportion to the face. One 11-year-old girl, speaking to researcher and journalist Cynthia Hind shortly after the event, described what the being's gaze felt like. He was looking at me, and I could feel what he was thinking. Not words, like a feeling going into me through his eyes, like a feeling going into me through his eyes. She was 11. She was in Zimbabwe. She had not read Barney Hill's transcripts. The deeper I went into these accounts, the more that phrase, through the eyes, recurred. Not metaphorically. Witnesses across cultures, across decades, consistently described the eyes of the grey as the primary instrument of what happens in the first 60 seconds. Not the hands, not any device. The eyes. And here's the strangest part. Whatever is transmitted through that gaze appears, if we take the witness accounts at face value, to function as a kind of rapid information transfer, or alternately, a kind of override command. Multiple abductees described the moment of eye contact with the grey as the point at which their fear, paradoxically, diminishes or transforms. Not because the being is reassuring, but because something changes in them at a neurological level that they can only describe as a kind of internal muting. Travis Walton, who disappeared for 5 days following an alleged encounter near Snowflake, Arizona, in November 1975, an absence corroborated by 6 other witnesses who saw him taken, described the moment of first eye contact during his initial 60 seconds aboard the craft as producing an almost immediate shift in his cognitive state. Not calmness, something more like recalibration, as though his nervous system had been addressed directly and told to stand down. My mind went from screaming, Walton said in a 1996 interview, to something like listening. I wasn't calmer, I was just different. Like a station that got changed. Like a station that got changed. How do you explain that? With trauma theory? With dissociation? Perhaps. But dissociation tends to produce fragmented recall, not heightened sensory clarity. And what characterizes most abduction accounts of the initial 60 seconds is, in fact, a disturbing precision of memory, rather than the haziness we would expect from a traumatic dissociative episode. The official psychological explanation, applied generically here, struggles at this precise point. I want to introduce you to a particular medical professional. I won't use her full name here because she requested partial anonymity when she agreed to speak with researchers for Dr. John Mack's Harvard study in the early 1990s. She is referred to in the documentation as Karen, a surgeon practicing in the American Midwest who experienced what she believed was an abduction event in 1988. What makes her account relevant here isn't the larger experience, it's what she describes in the first 60 seconds. After the paralysis, after being lifted, she found herself standing in a room she described as white but not white, like light pretending to be a surface. And before anything else happened, before any examination, before any communication, she reports that one of the beings raised its hand and passed it slowly, not touching, approximately 4 to 6 inches above her body, moving from her head to her feet in a single continuous gesture. It took maybe 10 seconds, she told Dr. Mack. And it wasn't nothing. I could feel it, like a warmth, but internal. Inside the skin, not on it. Like being scanned. Like being scanned. This is not an isolated description. The scanning gesture, a slow non-contact pass of the hand or a small device over the body, appears in case files from England, Brazil, Australia, Russia and across the United States with a consistency that defies easy explanation. Betty Andreasson-Luca described it. Leah Haley, a woman from Alabama who reported multiple abduction experiences throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, described it. Debbie Jordan Coble, whose experiences were documented in Abducted in 1994, described it. In each case, the scan occurs early, within that first 60-second window, before any more invasive procedures are reported, before samples are taken, before any implant-related activity. The scan comes first. What are they reading? What information does that gesture collect? And why? If these are separate events generated by isolated human psychology, by false memory, by cultural contamination, why is the scan a first step? Why not last? Why not never? This raises a simple but critical question. If abduction experiences are fabrications of the traumatized mind, why does the fabricated mind, across cultures and decades, independently invent the same procedural sequence? I've been talking about the first 60 seconds as though they're clearly defined, and for most of what I've described so far, they are. The silence, the freeze, the float, the eyes, the scan. These all occur within what witnesses consistently describe as the opening minute of their experience. But here's where the timeline becomes genuinely vertiginous. Many abductees report that somewhere within that first 60 seconds, sometimes at the 30-second mark, sometimes earlier, there is a discontinuity. A gap, not unconsciousness exactly, more like a cut. One moment they are in the initial phase, the next moment they are somewhere else, on the table or in a different room, or back in their bed, with no experiential bridge between the two states. Researcher Thomas Eddie Bullard, whose 1987 comparative analysis of nearly 300 abduction accounts remains one of the most methodologically careful surveys in the field, identified this transition gap as one of the most consistent elements across the entire corpus of abduction testimonies. The accounts agree, he noted, not just on the existence of this gap, but on its placement, almost always occurring in the earliest phase of the experience before the examination period proper begins. Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson, the two men who reported being abducted from a fishing pier on the Pascagoula River in Mississippi in October 1973, both described being on the pier, then simply being inside the craft with no perceived journey between the 2 points. No corridor, no transport, no sense of acceleration or movement, just pier, then craft. I don't know how I got there, Hickson told Sheriff Fred Diamond in a recorded interview that same night, meaning, importantly, before any public discussion of abduction tropes could have contaminated his account. 1 second, I'm on the bank, then I'm inside, there's nothing in between. Nothing in between. The implications of this are significant and underexplored. If the beings are using some form of rapid spatial displacement, if they are not, in other words, carrying people through physical space, but relocating them through some other mechanism, then the first 60 seconds are not a journey. They are a procedure, a preparation, a series of steps executed with clinical efficiency before the witness's consciousness is transferred to another location. The deeper I go into this, the more the first 60 seconds begin to look less like the opening of an abduction and more like a protocol. Step 1, silence the environment. Step 2, immobilize the subject. Step 3, establish ocular contact and neural communication. Step 4, conduct preliminary scan. Step 5, transfer time a protocol, documented in the field notes of hundreds of independent researchers, described in the words of thousands of independent witnesses. I want to return to aerial school for a moment, because the 1994 Zimbabwe incident deserves more than a passing reference. 62 children, an open sunlit schoolyard, morning recess, no darkness, no isolation, none of the conditions under which false memories are classically induced by fear. And yet, in the accounts of children as young as 6, we find the same sequential fingerprint, the silencing, the stillness, the sense of being looked at before the beings were fully visible. Several of the older children described what sounds, unmistakably, like the scanning gesture, a sensation of being inspected from a distance through the eyes alone, without physical contact. Dr. John Mack travelled to Zimbabwe to interview the children in person. What he found, he later told audiences, deeply disturbed his prior professional framework. These children from Christian, Muslim, Hindu and indigenous African backgrounds described a shared external event with a consistency of detail that he had never encountered in his clinical work with adult abductees in the United States. "I can explain individual fantasy," Mack said in a 1995 lecture at the Cambridge Forum. "I can explain cultural conditioning. I cannot explain 62 children in full daylight producing corroborating accounts of the same sequence of events with specific details that match nothing in their cultural background. Nothing in their cultural background. These children had no framework for what they saw, no Hollywood template, no bedtime story that produced the grey. They drew what they drew because that is what they said they saw, and what they saw, even from a distance, even without the full 60-second contact experience, maps onto the same template. The large eyes that communicate directly, the stillness, the sense of inspection. The evidence suggests something much larger than any of our existing explanatory frameworks can comfortably contain. I need to address, even briefly, the question of implants because they bear directly on our timeline. And what's notable for our purposes is where in the 60-second sequence researchers believe the implant procedure occurs. This is disputed. Let me be clear about that. Whether physical implants are real, whether the objects that have been surgically removed from alleged abductees are of extraterrestrial origin, these remain genuinely open questions. But within the framework of abductee testimony, implant placement is consistently reported as occurring after the first 60 seconds. After the initial protocol, it is not part of the opening sequence. It comes later in what witnesses describe as the examination phase. What does this tell us? If the first 60 seconds are preliminary, if they constitute a preparation phase, then they are logistically distinct from the examination itself. The beings arrive with a procedure. They execute the opening steps first, and only when the opening phase is complete does anything else begin. Dr. Roger Lear, a podiatric surgeon in California who claimed to have surgically removed alleged implant objects from over a dozen individuals between 1995 and his death in 2014, noted something in his case data that strikes me as relevant. In every case he examined, the patient described a specific moment of loss of control early in their abduction experience, a moment they could date, describe, and emotionally locate, which preceded the first awareness of any physical procedure. That moment of loss of control is, I think, the 60-second window, the preparation, the scanning, the neural override accomplished through those overwhelming black eyes. Whatever comes after, and the testimony suggests that what comes after is extensive and deeply strange, begins here, in this first minute, in these opening 60 seconds that the witnesses remember with such unsettling, counterintuitive clarity. I've been circling an idea that I want to address directly now, even knowing that I can't resolve it. The environmental silence that initiates the 60-second sequence, that quality of the world going mute before any being appears, has a plausible technological interpretation if we allow ourselves to consider it. Multiple researchers, including Jacques Vallée, the French-American astronomer and computer scientist, who spent decades analysing UFO data, have suggested that electromagnetic field effects consistent with the proximity of certain reported craft could account for the failure of electronic devices, televisions, radios, engines that witnesses report in the initial phase. Vale was careful. He did not claim certainty. He noted that the EM field signatures reported by witnesses in close encounter cases were consistent with patterns produced by large rotating electromagnetic sources. He also noted, with characteristic precision, that these same field effects could theoretically produce neurological disturbances in human subjects, including suppression of voluntary motor function, altered perception of time, and heightened visual acuity accompanied by reduced processing of peripheral sensory data. In other words, the silence, the freeze, the altered state of perception, all potentially explicable as effects of a proximate electromagnetic field of sufficient strength and specific configuration. I am not making a technological claim here. I am not saying that's what it is. But once you place that possibility alongside the consistency of witness testimony, the narrative that these events produce, the silence, then the freeze, then the eyes, then the scan, then the gap, begins to look less like a hallucination and more like the predictable human response to an external physical process. And that is where the official explanation begins to collapse under its own weight. Because if this is a hallucination, it is the same hallucination, produced at the same time in the same sequence by thousands of people who have never met. If it is cultural contamination, if people are simply describing what they've read or seen in films, then we must explain Betty Andreasson-Luca in 1967, who had neither read about nor seen depictions of what she described. We must explain Antonio Vilas-Boas in 1957 in a rural Brazilian farming community with no access to American science fiction. We must explain 62 Zimbabwean schoolchildren in 1994 drawing large-eyed beings in the daylight of an African morning. Not X, not Y, not Z, not hallucination, not contamination, not synchronized mass hysteria, but something else, something that the frameworks we have are simply not equipped to name. There is one final element of the first 60 seconds that I have been saving, not because it is the most dramatic, because it is the most disturbing. Across a significant subset of abductee accounts, in the Mac cases, in the Jacobs cases, in the MUFON files, witnesses describe a moment of apparent communication occurring within the first 60 seconds. Not communication through language, not through gesture, through the eyes, through what multiple witnesses describe as a direct transfer of meaning, not words but knowing, that seems to occur during or immediately after the initial eye contact with the primary being. And the content of that communication across many of these accounts touches on the same themes, not threats, not announcements of conquest. Something more ambiguous, something that multiple witnesses struggling for language describe as an explanation, a conveyed sense of purpose, an attempt to communicate that what is happening is, from the perspective of the beings, necessary. Katarina Wilson put it this way: I didn't hear words, but I knew they were telling me they had no reason. I knew they wanted me to understand that this wasn't cruelty. Whether I believed it was another question, but they wanted me to know. Barbara Lamb, a licensed marriage and family therapist in California who has worked with hundreds of abductees and been present for many regression sessions, noted in a 2011 interview. A remarkable number of my clients describe this moment of apparent communication in the opening seconds, and nearly all of them describe it as the beings attempting to convey legitimacy. Not requesting consent, the paralysis has already removed the question of consent, but offering, for reasons that remain opaque, something like an explanation. Not requesting consent, offering an explanation. I don't know what to do with that. I've thought about it for months and I still don't know what to do with it. If these beings are simply taking, if this is abduction in the most brutal, non-consensual sense, then why the explanation? Why, in the opening seconds, does any communication occur at all? Why not simply proceed? What does it mean that across thousands of accounts the beings appear to pause briefly in those first 60 seconds to convey something that witnesses interpret as a kind of rationale? Are they concerned with the psychological state of their subjects? Are they running some kind of pre-procedure protocol that requires the subject's nervous system to reach a specific state before proceeding? Or, and this is the question that keeps me awake, is the communication itself part of the mechanism? Is the explanation a neurological tool delivered through those enormous eyes that produces the calm that witnesses describe? Is the message the sedative? Let me tell you what we have. We have thousands of independent accounts drawn from every inhabited continent, spanning 7 decades of recorded testimony, and describing a common 60-second sequence with consistent structural features: silence, freeze, ocular contact, scan, transfer. We have that sequence appearing in the accounts of Brazilian farmers and American surgeons, of African schoolchildren and Russian politicians, of college students on canoe trips and retired teachers in their bedrooms in suburban England. We have researchers from the fringes and from Harvard who have spent careers trying to explain this consistency, and have, the most honest among them, admitted that no existing model fully accounts for it. We have physical correlates, EM field effects, alleged implants, ground trace evidence at landing sites, that resist complete dismissal, even under the scrutiny of qualified scientists who approach the data skeptically. And we have, at the centre of all of it, those 60 seconds, that first minute, that opening protocol that these beings, whatever they are, wherever they are from, appear to execute with an efficiency that implies not improvisation, not aggression, but procedure. A procedure that has been performed, the evidence suggests, many thousands of times. A procedure that appears, and I choose this word carefully, practiced. The official silence on this subject has been deafening for decades. Government bodies in the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Australia have declassified portions of their UFO investigation programs, confirming that the phenomenon was taken seriously at the highest levels of intelligence and military analysis. The Condon Report of 1968, commissioned by the US Air Force and widely cited as the definitive scientific dismissal of UFO phenomena, has since been characterized by multiple scientists, including members of its own study group, as a politically predetermined conclusion dressed in the language of scientific rigor. The British Ministry of Defence's Project Condon report, declassified in 2006, acknowledged that unidentified aerial phenomena were real, physically significant, and poorly understood. None of these documents address abduction. None of them touch the 60-second window. The documentation, right at the point where it might become most revealing, goes quiet. The files end, the records thin. The transition from we acknowledge the phenomenon to we understand what it does is simply missing. The silence was deafening, and the gap in the documentation is itself a kind of evidence. I began this investigation as a skeptic. I remain technically a skeptic. I don't know that aliens exist. I don't know that anyone has ever been physically transported aboard a non-human craft. I don't know what the beings with the large black eyes are, where they come from, or what they want. But I know what the witnesses say. And I know that what the witnesses say across 7 decades and 6 continents and thousands of individual accounts is not random. It is not chaotic. It is not the expected output of independent human fantasy or cultural contamination. It is a sequence. It is a protocol. And the fact that we don't know what the protocol is for, that we don't know what the scan collects, what the eye contact transmits, what the silence signals, what the explanation means, doesn't make the protocol less real. It makes it more urgent. Once you see it, you truly cannot unsee it. The patterns are there, embedded in transcripts, in hypnotic regression sessions, in the wide-eyed drawings of Zimbabwean children, and the halting testimony of a Brazilian farmer recorded in 1957. The pattern was never hidden. It was simply waiting for someone to ask the right question. Not what is abducting people, not where the beings come from, not why they choose the individuals they choose, or what they ultimately do with them. No. The question that the evidence has led me to, slowly, reluctantly, with considerable discomfort, is simpler than any of those. Who wrote the protocol? Because something, or someone, designed those 60 seconds, engineered them, refined them over time into the consistent, efficient, repeating sequence that thousands of human beings have experienced and described in their own broken languages from their own frightened perspectives across an unbroken span of modern human history. Whoever they are, whatever they are, the Greys did not arrive without a plan. They arrive with 60 seconds. And in those 60 seconds, everything that follows is prepared, initiated, and set in motion, with a precision that, the deeper you look, the more it resembles not the behavior of a visiting species encountering humanity for the first time, but the behavior of a species that has been doing this for a very long time.